The unseen questions in the English HSC can often be problematic. There's a misconception that you can't prepare for them, but you definitely can. Good morning. Today I'm going to be sharing my 10 tips to do well in the HSC English unseen questions. Whether you're studying standard or advanced with extension, we all have to do it. I've had a couple friends and some students I tutor, and they just really study hard and get good marks in the essays, but then they scrape by with a pass in the unseen texts, and it's really affecting your overall mark. I've realised it's just not that well known how to effectively study for these unseen texts. There is much more you can do than just revise language techniques. I was able to use these steps to improve. In fact, the unseen texts sometimes ended up being the strongest part of my exam in extension and advanced. And I've also seen others use these steps to improve too. So let's start simple. Firstly, you want to make sure you know how to really unpack and answer the questions. This is a skill that's needed for all subjects, and I have another video which explains this in depth. Basically, in that video, I explain the importance of knowing the syllabus and being able to identify connections between the question and the syllabus, considering how many marks the question is worth and allocating the correct amount of time. Then I go through how to break up the question and make sure you're answering all parts of it. Secondly, make sure you create your own notes for the unseen texts. What I mean by this is you should be making your own list of literary devices, your own vocab list, your own notes on the syllabus. People don't realize how important this is. You cannot download a list of language devices or a vocab list off the internet. These lists tend to be really long and complicated, and the only way to study them is just straight repetition. And that's boring and often ineffective. You're unlikely to use the word epoch in your answers just because you read it 4 times in a vocab list. What's much more effective is creating your own notes. Whatever year you're in at school, create a glossary for English. Mine was in OneNote, but yours can be in a notebook or wherever. When you come across something you haven't heard before, just write it down, and when you record it, try to write down the exact example that was used to explain it to you. That way, when you look back, you're building an associative memory. So you're not just remembering the word and its meaning, you're remembering the teacher, the classroom, the specific example, and all these things make it much more likely for you to remember, to understand, and to use that phrase, that literary device, the word, whatever. I was looking back through my glossary and I saw the word sibilance, which is basically when a hissing sound is created through a phrase. And I remembered the exact example my teacher used, which classroom we were in. We were studying T.S. Eliot, I think Preludes, and she read out this phrase. He describes the smell of steaks in passageways, 6 o'clock, the burnt out ends of smoky days. So you can really hear the sibilance in that phrase, and it's a really good example. And I found it easy to remember. I still remember it to this day just because I have personal experience with it. So that is the importance of making your own notes. 3, do open book practices. I think that the most powerful thing you can do to improve your answers to unseen texts is to do practice papers with these notes you've made yourself in front of you and no time restrictions, no pressure. This means you can read the questions with the syllabus in front of you and really look into how the two connect. You can fully unpack the question without stress. You can take as long as you want to read the texts and use your glossary to find the most interesting, the most effective techniques. The only way you're going to get comfortable identifying and analysing techniques that aren't just simile, metaphor, imagery. Things like anaphora, synecdoche, polysynecton, metalinguistics. The only way you're going to start introducing those kind of techniques into your analysis is if you practice using them. And the best way to practice is with your notes in front of you and no pressure. You can also practice writing your answers really well, even if it takes a while. This whole process gets you used to how the questions are written, how to find quotes, and how to really nail your answers. Answering with unseen texts is one of those skills where you need to become quite good before you can become quick. So practice papers are absolutely key. Fourthly, you want to make sure you are putting in the time. So this kind of feeds on from my last bit of advice about practice papers. You want to be putting the same amount of time into this section as you put into the other sections of the English exam. Students seem to know they need hours to read, write, practice for the English essays. Module A, Module B, Module C, we're all expecting to study a lot. But when it comes to the unseen texts, there are students that go into their trials without having done a proper past paper. Practice is more important in this section than any of the other sections. You can't prepare analysis in this section like you can in the other ones. All the time you saved not preparing essays should be put into practice papers. As a minimum, you want to do 3 open book practice papers and 2 under time conditions before you sit an exam with unseen texts. Now to get into a little bit of exam strategy. 5. Read the questions first and the texts second. This one is really well known, but I had to mention it because it's important. You should read the first question and the corresponding text, the second question and the corresponding text, that kind of order. Reading the question first just primes your brain to pick up what is needed from the text. 6. Underline possible quotes. So reading time is over and you're diving into the first question, but before you start writing, do another read of the text, a skim read, and just underline any possible quotes. Your brain has been primed in the first reading by reading the question first, so in the second skim, a lot of the quotes and the techniques should come out a lot easier. 7. Structure your answers. I could probably do a whole other video on how to answer different types of questions with the unseen texts. Honestly though, a lot of it just comes with practice. I can recommend using something like PEEL, point, example, explain, link, teal, steal, whatever. You don't need to put pressure on yourself to follow it to the T, but you just want to think about it as a guideline. Also, in terms of PEEL, it's more like PEEL, if you get what I'm saying, because you want to have a couple examples and explanations before you link back to any point. Also, you want to make sure you're starting and finishing your examples with lots of power. Link it back to the question, link it back to the syllabus, link it back to the module. I mean, if you can, link it back to the whole human condition. So that's a few notes on structure. 8. Make sure your writing is academic, but not superfluous. By this, I'm referring to the trend in which people are either really casual or just really extra. By casual, I mean some people who write, the author seems to make us feel the emotion of grief by repeatedly referencing the color black. No. First of all, unless the text title and the author's name are atrociously long and complicated to write out, write them out. But also don't be too extra. You don't want to compensate for a lack of understanding with really flowery language. Jane Austen, in her 18-something novel, Sense and Sensibility, expresses the evocative and powerful human emotion of grief through the extended motif of the black color. You don't want that. You want something in the middle of those two. So something like, in this extract from Sense and Sensibility, Austen communicates the human emotion of grief through a black motif, which first appears, quote, explain. So academic, just not superfluous. 9. Become unstuck. If you're stuck, look for the obvious. Stating the obvious is much better than stating nothing at all, and by just thinking about the text like this, it often starts the flow of better ideas. My teachers used to say this, and I've experienced it as someone who's marked short answers as a tutor. Often the beginning it's a bit clunky, but as the student writes, the better ideas start to flow. So for example, maybe you've been asked to explain how the human experience of grief is communicated, and all you can think of is that the color black is referenced a lot. As you start writing, you realize that the author is referencing a charred black fire, and you might start to see that the fire is symbolic of the burnt out life that the character is grieving, and then you start to see this as an extended metaphor, and then you see that the author is using a lexical chain to build some atmosphere. I'm just making something up, but you can see how from something simple, it can build into something a little bit more complex. But if you're really stuck, just come back to it. Mentally prepare yourself for the chance that you may not be able to answer a question on the first go. And this is important because you can come back to it, it's fine. You just don't want to freak yourself out in the exam. Like, I can't answer this, I'm not going to be able to answer anything, and then just start getting very stressed. So mentally prepare yourself so you can stay calm and just know that you can become unstuck. Finally, number 10, double check your answers. Answers to the unseen texts are the part of the English exam that most need double checking. You've never seen the text before, you're writing on the fly, so you can come up with some pretty weird stuff. I've definitely experienced going back to the beginning of the exam, or even getting the exam back, and reading my answers and just thinking, what was I trying to say? I recommend going back and checking at the end of the exam. I say this because you want to make sure you've attempted all the questions first. You don't want to go back and polish if half of the last question isn't going to get finished. And also, if you check something right after you wrote it, you are very likely to read what you think you wrote rather than what you actually wrote. Basically, you're more likely to read over your mistakes. So put a bit of distance between the writing and the proofreading and you will definitely get yourself a couple extra marks in the unseen texts. Okay, so those are my 10 tips to study for the unseen texts in the HSC English exams. Let me know if you have any other good tips, and I hope this helped.